The first sound Joshua Turner ever heard wasn't a lullaby. It was the crack of a whip splitting the dawn. He was born not in a home, but in a toolshed behind the Griggs plantation in Pulaski, Tennessee, a place where babies were wrapped in burlap, not blankets, and mothers whispered prayers that no one heard. His mother, Clara, pressed him to her chest and rocked him in the dark, whispering, "Don't cry, baby. They don't like noise. They don't like new mouths." From his first breath, silence was survival. Joshua's father, Benjamin, had already learned that lesson the hard way. Years before Joshua's birth, Benjamin dared to ask an overseer if the men could stop work early during fever season. The next morning, his tongue was nailed to the side of a barn. He lived, but never spoke again. So when Joshua was old enough to understand, silence was already in his blood. The plantation wasn't the biggest in Tennessee, but it was one of the cruelest. Elias Griggs, the owner, called his slaves his shadow people. Said they carried the weight of his sins so he could sleep at night. Every field, every stalk of cotton was watered with sweat, screams, and the kind of grief that never dries. By the age of 5, Joshua had already learned 3 things. First, white men don't blink when they hurt you. Second, crying only makes the pain last longer. And third, the only freedom you can find is in your own mind, and even that they try to burn. He picked cotton until his fingers split, hauled water until his arms trembled, slept on dirt that never cooled. But in the rare quiet of night, when the others whispered about Africa, about names and drums and places where people weren't born to be broken, Joshua listened. He didn't know what Africa was, but he knew what freedom felt like inside his chest. It began as a flicker, a spark he couldn't name. That spark turned to flame the day they killed his father. Benjamin had stolen nothing more than 2 handfuls of maize, just to keep Clara from fainting in the field. Griggs found out. He tied Benjamin to a new post made of iron so the sun would cook his skin while the whip did the rest. Joshua was 9 years old, standing barefoot in the dust, watching his mother beg until her jaw was broken by a boot. He didn't cry. He watched. He memorized. That night, Benjamin died in silence, and something inside Joshua was born in his place. A kind of fire that doesn't burn out. A rage too quiet for words. He buried his father with his bare hands behind the shed. No marker. No prayer. Just a boy, a mound of dirt, and the promise he whispered into the dark. One day they'll hear me. There were nights when the dogs howled without cause. No scent, no strangers, just a sound that clawed its way through the dark. Joshua used to wonder if they howled for the same reason he stared at the stars, to remember a life they'd never lived. One of the old field hands, Isaiah, once told him, "The dogs ain't loyal to the master. They just scared of being hungry." Then he'd laugh that dry, cracked laugh only broken men can manage. But even then, Joshua saw it. Fear wasn't loyalty. It was just another kind of chain. He was 10 when he began studying those dogs, how they moved, how they breathed, which ones hesitated before they bit. It was the same with people. He watched who laughed at a whipping, who turned away, who reached for a drink to forget. Observation became survival. But nothing he learned could prepare him for the night they came for his little brother. Caleb was barely 7. Small, thin, with eyes too big for his face. He laughed only when no one was around, a tiny spark of joy in a world that punished noise. One morning, Clara woke to find his mat empty, only a torn scrap of burlap and a rock scratched with one word: free. He'd tried to run. Joshua froze when he heard. The others just worked faster, pretending they hadn't seen the empty bed. No one dared speak. The air that day was thick, like the world itself was holding its breath. By dusk, the dogs began to howl again. Louder this time. Closer. Joshua didn't move when he saw the riders return, torches low, horses snorting. Behind them, dragged by a rope, was Caleb's small body. The handlers laughed. One kicked at the boy's leg and muttered, "Little rat didn't get far." His mother screamed until her voice cracked. The next day, they left the body in the yard, said it was a lesson. Joshua didn't cry. He just stared at his brother's face, torn and still, and felt something deeper than pain, something heavier, colder. That night, Isaiah found him sitting alone behind the woodpile, arms wrapped around his knees. "You feel it now, don't you?" the old man asked softly. Joshua didn't answer. "It's crawling inside you. Not fear. Not sadness. Something else." Joshua looked up, eyes hollow. "I won't run." Isaiah nodded once. "I know." Joshua's voice dropped lower, barely a whisper. "One day, they won't hear me coming either." From that night on, the boy who once stared at the stars was gone. In his place stood something quieter, sharper, a vessel made of silence and memory. He worked harder, spoke less, and watched more. The guards changed shifts. The keys hung on the same nail. The men who laughed the loudest drank the most. He stored every detail away, piece by piece, until the silence became his shield, and the rage beneath it his weapon. The blood had taught him pain. The silence was teaching him patience. The war ended with a whisper, not a victory cry. No parades, no trumpets, just words spreading across dusty roads. "You're free now." Joshua was 20 when those words reached Pulaski, Tennessee. He stood barefoot in the fields, sweat burning his eyes, watching Union soldiers pass by with flags too tattered to mean anything. The men in gray were gone, but the eyes that had owned him were still there, staring through him like nothing had changed. They said the chains were broken, but no one came to cut them. Elias Griggs didn't even bother announcing it. One day, he simply stopped calling them slaves, started calling them laborers, offered contracts full of promises, wages and credits, housing benefits. It all sounded like freedom until you saw the fine print. Debts that never vanished, payments that never came, and signatures that meant servitude with a new name. Joshua refused to sign. He didn't need to read the papers to know what they meant. He'd learned to read men's faces instead, and Griggs' smile was the same one he wore before a whipping. That night, Griggs sent men to teach him respect. They found Joshua walking back from the creek with a bundle of firewood. 4 of them, 2 drunk, 1 with a badge, 1 carrying a rope. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. The first hit drove him to the ground. The second broke a rib. By the third, he wasn't fighting back anymore, just tasting blood and dirt, staring at the same soil that had once swallowed his father. They left him there, not dead, just broken enough to remember. It took weeks to heal. Weeks of moving slow, breathing shallow, working for scraps where no one asked names. But in that silence, something else grew, clarity. He saw what the war had really done. It didn't end slavery. It reshaped it. The cotton fields were still full. Only now the owners called it work. The overseers still cracked their whips. Only now they called it law. The Klan was born out of that lie. It started small, men in taverns, whispering about pride and God, about taking their land back. Veterans in white sheets calling themselves defenders. But by 1867, those whispers had turned into torches. Freedmen vanished overnight. Crosses burned outside cabins. Bodies swung from trees with badges pinned to their coats. Joshua watched it happen. He saw the same cruelty, just wearing a new uniform. And when a 16-year-old boy named Daniel, brave, loud, foolishly hopeful, tried to organize a defense and ended up in a dry well with his hands bound behind him, Joshua stopped pretending peace was coming. That night, he went to the same patch of dirt where his brother had died, knelt down, and whispered not to God, but to the bones buried beneath. "Give me patience," he said. "Give me eyes that don't close. Give me a mask they can't see through." And as the wind shifted through the fields, Joshua Turner rose, not as a freed man, but as a man preparing to hunt. Pulaski, Tennessee, 1867. The nights grew louder than the days. At first, it was only rumors. White men meeting in barns after dark. Talk of a brotherhood, a circle of knights. But Joshua knew what those words meant. They were the same old hate dressed in ritual and secrecy. One night, as he was returning from the stables, he saw them for the first time. 10 riders, white hoods glowing under torchlight, horses moving like ghosts across the field. No shouts. No laughter. Just the slow, rhythmic thud of hooves and the soft hiss of burning pitch. They left behind a cross, still smoking, planted in the yard of a freedman's cabin. By morning, that cabin was ash. They called themselves the Ku Klux Klan, defenders of the South, guardians of purity, soldiers of God. But Joshua saw what they really were, the same men who'd killed his father, his brother, his people. Just now, they were allowed to hide behind cloth and call it honor. He watched from a distance, memorizing. The way they spoke, the way they moved, the way they covered their faces like cowards. He noticed their arrogance, how safe they felt, how sure they were that no one could ever touch them. The local sheriff wore a hood. So did the judge. Even the pastor, who'd once baptized Joshua's mother in muddy water, now led the Klan in prayer. It wasn't just hate. It was a system, a sickness with a heartbeat. And Joshua, the quiet man no one noticed anymore, decided to make that heartbeat stop. He started with patience. Took a job cleaning stables for a merchant named Barrett, a man who wore his cross on Sundays and his hood on Saturdays. Barrett trusted Joshua quickly. Men like him always trusted silence. Within weeks, Joshua was overhearing names, times, plans whispered behind closed doors. By the end of the month, he was invited to a meeting. It took place in a barn lit by lanterns and smoke. The air reeked of sweat, whiskey, and arrogance. Joshua stood at the edge as men in robes pledged oaths and spat into fire, speaking about purity, vengeance, and the restoration of order. Then came the moment. Barrett turned to him and held out a robe. "Brother," he said, smiling, "welcome to the cause." Joshua stared at it, that white cloth that had soaked up so much blood, and reached out his hand. He took it. The room erupted in cheers. He nodded once, silent as ever. Because sometimes, to kill the monster, you have to wear its skin. Later that night, under a broken moon, Joshua stared at himself in a cracked mirror, the hood over his face, the eyes of his enemies staring back through him. He didn't feel rage anymore, just purpose. And for the first time, he whispered, "Now, I see you." The first time Joshua wore the robe, it felt heavier than it looked. Not from the cloth, but from the ghosts it carried. The hood smelled of gunpowder and sweat. Its eye holes were uneven, its seams rough, its presence suffocating. But Joshua wore it without flinching. He had learned long ago how to breathe through pain. Under the name Jonas Hill, he became one of them. A trusted hand, a quiet listener, and the most dangerous man in Tennessee because nobody suspected him. The Klan met deep in the woods, always after midnight. 10, sometimes 20 men, farmers, merchants, preachers, men who wore holiness by day and horror by night. They called each other knights, spoke of cleansing and restoring the South, yet every word dripped with fear. Joshua could hear it in their voices. They were terrified of a world where black men could stand beside them as equals. He stayed silent, nodding when they preached, laughing when they bragged about their latest lesson. Each story burned through him like acid, but he endured, memorizing names, routes, and plans. When they rode, Joshua rode with them, through dark fields, over creeks, past burned-out cabins. Torches in hand, masks on faces, hearts full of rot. He saw the faces of the men who had killed boys like Daniel, who had beaten women like his mother, who had dragged men from their homes and hung them from trees that still bore the marks. He spoke little, but when he did, they listened. Barrett, the merchant, began to trust him more than anyone else. "You got the fire in you, Hill," he said once, slapping Joshua's shoulder. "The kind we need." Joshua nodded. He had the fire, they just didn't know who was meant to burn. At night, he returned to a small shack on the edge of the woods. There, in a circle of stones, he kept 3 things: a scrap of his father's shirt, a lock of his mother's hair, and a piece of the rope that had bound his brother. They were his altar, his reminders. One night, under the flicker of a dying candle, Joshua knelt before that altar and spoke to the silence. "I'm not asking," he whispered. "I'm offering." He cut his palm with a stone, let the blood drip into the fire. "For every name they took, I'll write a new one. For every child they silenced, I'll make them hear. The fire hissed, and the wind rose, almost answering. From then on, Joshua didn't just infiltrate, he hunted. Every handshake was a clue. Every word a weapon. He learned which men carried knives, which ones drank too much, which ones feared being alone. The Klan thought they had recruited another soldier for their holy war. But they hadn't found a follower. They had let in a ghost. And ghosts remember. It began on a night when even the crickets were quiet. Joshua rode with them, 10 men in white, torches flaring against the dark. Their target was a freedman named Elijah, a former soldier who had opened a small school in his home for black children. The town said it was unnatural. The Klan said it was blasphemy. And Barrett, their leader, said it was time to make an example. Joshua said nothing. He just followed. The group broke windows first, then tossed torches through them. The house erupted in flame. Children screamed as they ran barefoot into the night. Elijah fought back, swinging an axe handle, shouting for the children to flee. He struck one of the Klansmen hard enough to make him fall. Then they grabbed him. Joshua stood still, hidden behind his hood, while the man's screams filled the night. He felt his fingers tremble inside his gloves, not from fear, but from restraint. When Barrett ordered him to help lift the wounded Klansman back onto his horse, Joshua obeyed. "You've got ice in your veins," Barrett said approvingly. "That's what makes you useful." Joshua nodded once. "Elijah's got fire," he muttered, low enough for the others to hear. "Should have snuffed it sooner." They laughed, called him a true believer. But that night, back in his shack, Joshua carved a single word into the inside of his belt: Elijah. Not because Elijah had died, but because he hadn't. Because he had fought back. That was the spark Joshua needed. A week later, one of the men from that night, a brute named Barrow, the one who'd beaten Elijah until his own hands bled, didn't come home. No one noticed at first, until his horse returned alone, reins dangling, hooves splattered with mud. By morning, the whispers began. They found Barrow hanging from a tree in the woods, spine broken, hands bound behind his back with rope soaked in oil. Carved into the bark beside him were 2 letters: CT. Caleb Turner. The Klan panicked. Barrett tried to steady them. "One man dead don't make a war," he said. But Joshua saw it, that flicker of fear behind his eyes. Doubt had entered the room. And doubt spreads like rot. Within a month, another Klansman vanished. Deputy Rafford Stills, a man with a limp and a cruel smile. He'd once laughed about a boy named Daniel, the one they'd thrown into a well. Now his laughter was gone. They found him in an alley, a badge shoved into his mouth, the same letters, CT, carved into the wall beside him. 2 dead in 2 months. No witnesses. No sound. Just silence. And those letters that haunted every man in white. Joshua had delivered his first message. He wasn't hunting them for revenge anymore. He was balancing the scales. And the ghost they had created was now very much alive. The town's fear had grown so thick you could taste it. 2 Klansmen dead, no sound, no witnesses, only the echo of initials carved like scripture into wood. And still, the white robes gathered. Fear made them cling tighter to their lies. At the center of those lies stood Reverend Thaddeus Crane, the pastor of First Light Baptist Church. By day, he preached salvation. By night, he preached purity. Joshua remembered him from the plantation days, a tall man with a voice like thunder and a smile sharp enough to cut. When Joshua's father was dying from the sun and the whip, it was Crane who knelt beside him, whispering, "The Lord chastises those he loves." Then he'd handed Benjamin back to the same overseer who'd beaten him. Now Crane wore a collar and called himself a shepherd. But Joshua had seen his flock, men in hoods, burning crosses instead of candles. If Barrett was the Klan's mouth, Crane was its soul. To destroy the Klan, Joshua had to burn that soul out of the body. He started with patience, attended the sermons, sat in the back pew, eyes down, watched how Crane moved, when he paused, how he turned scripture into venom. The man spoke of light and love, yet his words dripped like oil, slick, poisonous, ready to ignite. After service, Joshua approached him, pretending to be humble. "Powerful words, Reverend," he said softly. Crane smiled. "You have a servant's spirit. What's your name?" "Jonas Hill." Joshua lied again. "Good man," Crane replied. "The Lord needs soldiers like you." Joshua nodded. "He already has one." He volunteered to help clean the church during the week. Moved pews, scrubbed floors, carried crates of hymn books, all while memorizing the building's back halls and hidden locks. He noticed how often Crane disappeared into the cellar after service, sometimes alone, sometimes with men who left through the side door instead of the front. One Thursday evening, Crane asked for help carrying boxes down those same stairs. The cellar smelled of old paper and gun oil. As they reached the bottom, Crane spoke without turning. "I know who you are." Joshua froze. Crane turned slowly, eyes gleaming in the lamplight. "You think I don't recognize vengeance when it walks upright? You've taken lives. But God will not." Joshua stepped forward, calm, blade in hand. "This ain't about God." Crane lifted a trembling hand. "You'll become what you hate." Joshua's voice was steady. "No. I became what you made." He pulled from his coat a small notebook, the Reverend's own handwriting, copied page by page. Lists of names, meeting places, burnings he'd blessed. Joshua had gathered it for weeks. "When they find you," he said, "they'll know who you really served." Crane lunged. Joshua struck once, silent, swift, final. At dawn, the church bell rang for prayer, but the preacher never came. Later, they found him in the well behind the rectory, hands folded in mock prayer, a page from the Bible nailed to a tree beside him. It read, "Wolves wear collars." The town wept, the Klan trembled, and Joshua Turner crossed another name from his list. Pulaski no longer slept. Doors stayed locked. Candles burned through the night. Even the bravest men jumped at the sound of creaking wood. The Klan had lost its preacher, its deputy, and two of its most vicious riders. Their meetings had turned from sermons to arguments, each man pointing fingers at the next. And through it all, Joshua stood among them, calm, silent, taking notes no one would ever read. Barrett, the merchant leader, tried to rally them. "We are soldiers of God," he shouted to a shrinking crowd. "We will not be intimidated by phantoms." But his hands trembled when he said it. Joshua noticed. Fear had found its way inside the hood. The town whispered of a ghost, a black spirit born of fire and vengeance, a man who moved like smoke and struck without sound. They called him the Turned One, Cain with a cause. Some said he wasn't even human. But Joshua didn't need their myths. The truth was enough. He wasn't a ghost. He was memory wearing a mask. The next name on his list was Jonas Maddox, a merchant who sold kerosene to the Klan and maps to their riders. He had never killed anyone himself. That's what he told himself, anyway, but his hands were just as bloody. Every drop of oil he sold fed the flames that devoured schools, churches, homes. Killing him wouldn't just send a message. It would starve the fire. Joshua waited. Watched. Maddox moved like a man who thought he'd bought safety. Guards at his door, pistol on his hip, God in his mouth. But greed makes men lazy. Joshua noticed his habits. Same meal, same walk home, same stop to light his pipe behind the general store. One fog-heavy night, Maddox turned that same corner and never came back. Joshua was waiting. No hood, no disguise, just silence. He dragged Maddox into a shed behind the blacksmith shop and bound his wrists with twine soaked in vinegar. "I never hurt nobody," Maddox begged. "I only sold what was asked." Joshua leaned close. "You built the fire." When morning came, the townspeople found ash where Maddox's store had been and burned into the doorway, 2 letters and a phrase, BC, blood calls. That same morning, half the Klan didn't show up to the meeting. Some fled town. Others buried their robes, swearing they were never part of it. But it was too late. Isaiah, the old field hand who'd once warned Joshua that dogs remember freedom, came to see him again. This time he brought others, men and women who'd lost sons, daughters, husbands. They sat in silence around Joshua's fire. "How many left?" Isaiah finally asked. Joshua's answer was quiet but certain. 4. No one spoke after that.
No one needed to.
The war that had started with whips and chains was being rewritten in fire. And for the first time in Pulaski's history, it wasn't black men who feared the dark, it was those who created it. Winter came late that year, as if the sky itself was waiting for something to end. The air hung heavy, thick with ash and silence. By now, the town no longer spoke the word Klan aloud. They called it the Brotherhood, the Cause, or simply the Thing. Because saying its name meant admitting it still existed, and admitting that meant living in fear. 5 men were gone, each death a sermon written in silence. And the remaining 2 names on Joshua's list were the hardest. The first was Silas Drummond, a former Confederate officer turned prison contractor. He didn't wear the robe. He paid for others to wear it for him. His labor camp on the county line was a new kind of slavery built from law instead of chains. He called it justice. But everyone knew what it was, a graveyard that produced cotton instead of peace. Joshua remembered the place. His uncle had been sent there once for loitering. They returned his body in pieces, claiming it was an accident with machinery. Joshua had never forgotten that lie. He walked the 10 miles to the camp alone, through snow and smoke, coat drawn tight, hood left behind. Inside the gates, guards shouted orders, too busy beating half-starved men to notice him slip through. He found Drummond in his office, sipping brandy beside a pot-belly stove. Joshua didn't speak. He moved like a shadow. Drummond reached for his pistol, too slow. The fight was quick, brutal, silent. A chair cracked, glass shattered, and when it ended, Drummond was gasping on the floor. Joshua dragged him outside, into the yard where dozens of prisoners stared through the frost. He lifted the iron collar that Drummond used on them, cold and rusted, and forced it around his neck. "You remember this," Joshua said, voice steady. "You remember him." He held up the torch. The flames danced in Drummond's eyes. Then the collar glowed red. When it was over, Joshua threw open the gates. "Go," he told the prisoners. "You're free." No one moved at first. Freedom had fooled them before. But then, one by one, they stepped out into the snow, silent, slow, as if walking in a dream. Behind them, the camp burned, not as vengeance, but as burial. Now only one name remained.
And it wasn't white.
His name was Morris, a house servant from Joshua's old plantation. Years ago, he had told the overseer about Caleb's escape, Joshua's little brother. Said it was to protect the boy. But everyone knew the truth. He was promised his own child would be spared if he gave Caleb up. They took both anyway. Joshua found him in the ruins of a burned chapel. Bent, scarred, half-blind. "You come to finish it?" Morris rasped. Joshua stared at him, saw the ruin, the regret. "You already did," he said quietly, and dropped his knife to the floor. Some ghosts weren't worth killing. Some had been dying for years. As Joshua walked away, the wind carried the smell of smoke and snow, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his vengeance lifting. 7 names. 1 left to write. His own. By the time spring crept back over Tennessee, Pulaski had gone quiet. Not peaceful, just hollow. The white robes were gone from clotheslines. The horses no longer rode at midnight. The torches that once burned in the fields had turned to ash. But the fear remained. Only now, it lived in the hearts of those who used to wear the hoods. 5 Klan leaders dead. 1 vanished without a trace. And every man who survived carried the same nightmare, a shadow behind the mask, a name whispered by the wind. Joshua Turner. He didn't disappear into legend overnight. He walked away, into the same woods where his father was buried, where his brother's blood had soaked the roots. There, beneath the trees, he dug up the small bundle he'd buried years before, the scrap of his father's shirt, his mother's braid, the rope that once held Caleb. He washed the cloth, wrapped the hair, and placed them side by side on the earth. Then, with slow hands, he built 7 small stone markers. 7 lives taken. 7 debts paid. And 1 more, his own. He carved his name into the final stone and sat before it until the sky began to pale. Isaiah found him there days later. The fire had burned out, but the ground was still warm. Joshua was gone, leaving behind only his knife and the faint outline of footprints leading toward the hills. Some said he fled north. Others claimed he joined a Union regiment under a false name.
But the old folks said different.
They said he never left. They said he became part of the land, the whisper in the pines, the wind that howled through the cotton fields, the shadow that followed men who spoke the old hate too loud. Years passed. The Klan tried to rise again, but never in Pulaski. Too many memories. Too many ghosts. Isaiah grew old, and when his voice began to fail, he gathered the townspeople outside the burned remains of the old church. He read aloud the names Joshua had written: Barrett, Crane, Drummond, and the others. He didn't speak their crimes. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. Then he spoke Joshua's name last, not with mourning, but with pride. Joshua Turner, he said, wasn't a killer. He was a reckoning. A boy in the crowd, no older than Caleb had been, asked what the pile of stones on the hill was. Isaiah smiled faintly. It's not a grave, child. It's a promise. That night, the boy walked to that hill alone, knelt beside the stones, and whispered the name again. The wind caught it, carried it through the trees, over the ashes, into the town that once called him monster. Joshua Turner. Not saint. Not sinner. Just a man who refused to die quietly. And in that refusal, he made the world remember.